Hi everyone. The first piece of literature that you will read for this online Introduction to Literature course is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which has been around for a couple hundred years now, and it is considered a Gothic work of fiction. In modern times, we might think more of Gothic or Goths as the people who dress around in black and have very pale skin and are making a certain fashion and social statement. However, the reference to Goth is a little bit more involved than that. So Gothic often is referring to something that is more harsh or cruel, going back to the Middle Ages and referring to a Germanic-style tribe. And in literature, it is associated with kind of a brooding sense of almost doom. There is something that's happening and mankind is probably to blame for that. So the Goths were Germanic barbarians, and they were, during the 5th to 8th century. Gothicism or Gothic is also associated with architecture, and when you see a Gothic piece of architecture, it's identifiable by its ornate structure, by its use of arches and buttresses, and an example of this would be Westminster Abbey in London. So when we talk about Gothic horror or Gothic fiction, you are combining two literary genres in one. So you are combining romance, which is swept up in this kind of high emotional state, along with horror, which is associating with the macabre, or things that are dark and secretive and sometimes scary. It was most popular in the 1760s to the early 19th century, and it is a movement away from Enlightenment, which was more concerned with logic and knowledge. Romanticism and Gothicism are very much about feelings and heightened feelings. There's this notion that we get pleasure from being terrorized in a safe way, and we do this today. We go to scary films, we watch scary series on Netflix, we do it from the comfort and safety of our home or from a theater, knowing that we're fine, but we get that vicarious sense of thrill, and that has been popular for a very long time. So some common elements that you'll see in Gothic fiction include the use of ghosts, supernatural, or mad/crazy people. So you see that in Frankenstein. We don't have ghosts necessarily, but we have people who are perhaps thought to be mad or out of their minds. You have mutations and deformities, which is classic to Frankenstein. However, do keep in mind that Frankenstein is not the creature. Dr. Frankenstein is the person who created the creature, so that is something that people often mistake with this story. You have stormy weather and extreme landscapes. It Was a Dark and Stormy Night is probably the quintessential way to begin a work of Gothic fiction, because weather predicts and foreshadows events that happen in Gothic pieces. So if the weather is turning sour, you can bet that something bad is going to happen. And they often revolve around some kind of fall from grace. So people were at a level in their lives where they were well thought of. Dr. Frankenstein was certainly that. And then they in some way fall. And that could be by outside forces or their own doing. There are curses, omens, and secrets that are often involved. Usually you will see references to castles, labyrinths, secret passageways, and trapdoors. Women in distress, the fading heroine who needs to be rescued from the tower in the castle. That's more associated with Romanticism. You add a little bit of supernatural in there and you got Gothic romance. And you sometimes will get grave robbing or interactions with cadavers. We do have that in Frankenstein as well. Dr. Frankenstein goes to the, prisons where they would have bodies where no one would claim, because they often didn't give prisoners a proper burial, and so he would take those bodies, take body parts, and use them to construct his creature or his monster. So some popular Gothic lit that you might be familiar with is obviously Frankenstein, which we are reading by Mary Shelley, works by Edgar Allan Poe, Stephen King, and Anne Rice being two of the more common, more recent modern Gothic writers. Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre by the two Bronte sisters, and then Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. So these all, if you have read any or some of them, you will start to recognize the patterns of, again, heightened emotions, people who are not necessarily very mellow people who have very high senses of drama. You have these dreary castles, landscapes, perfect for where a lot of these writers were from. They were sitting in bogs and watching the not so pleasant weather, the mist and the fog and the rain. And when Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, she was in Switzerland with her partner and some friends who were also authors, and the weather was horrible. And it was a summer when it was one of the coldest summers on record. And so they had this contest to write this story, and Mary Shelley is the only one who finished, and that is how Frankenstein was born. Some common questions that you want to ask as you read Gothic fiction is, who am I, why am I here, and why was I made? These are questions that you will ask of the creature that Dr. Frankenstein creates. These are the questions that the creature asks of himself. How does the setting define the character? So the setting switches a lot in Frankenstein. There are multiple settings, multiple narrators in Frankenstein, and those are sometimes reflective of the characters who are being talked about or written about. Who is included and who is excluded from certain surroundings, that can be important. So if you're not hearing from everybody's voices, you have to take into account that it's one-sided. And so what would the opposition say or the antagonist say if he were to have the same amount of space to tell his story? Fortunately, in Frankenstein, we hear from the creature, and we hear from Dr. Frankenstein, and we hear from the narrator, Walden, but all of them are somewhat second accounts by Walden. So we start to ask, who can we trust? And as a critical reader, you should always ask that. What are the repercussions of excluding some of those voices? And who or what is the other? Is it a metaphor for something? You will see throughout works of fiction the reference to the other. Maybe not covert or overtly referenced to the other, but the idea of the other is that anybody who is outside of social norms is the other. And those people who are othered oftentimes are relegated to substandard types of living. They don't have the same credibility. They don't get treated as fairly, and you see this in all instances, whether it's people who look and sound different, like the creature does, people who are of a different race or a different gender. So in more modern fiction, when we're dealing specifically with issues like that, you'll start to see them in social issues. But in works like Frankenstein, it was a matter of this huge creature who has skin that's a different color and limbs and supposedly sutures to hold him together would be something that people would stop and stare at, and therefore he's treated differently because of that. And that is something that Gothic fiction attempts to address. So that's a little bit on Gothic fiction. I want to tell you a little bit, I'm going to pull up my Mary Shelley. I want to tell you a little bit about Shelley and her life. So Mary Shelley is the child of revolutionary people. She is the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote The Vindication on the Rights of Women. She was a feminist before feminism was actually named. And her father, William Godwin, was a radical thinker. He also wrote, and he was considered an anarchist by some in his time. So she was from a very free-spirited family that encouraged critical thinking and encouraged independence and was somewhat outside of the social norms of that time. When Mary was about 16, she fell in love with a man named Percy Bysshe Shelley, and he was married at that point and was older than she was, and they had a dramatic love affair, and they ended up being together, but in the interim, Percy's wife, who was pregnant, committed suicide. And so they didn't start their relationship on a completely whole level. They had a lot of backlash from society at the time because of those happenings. Frankenstein, as I said, was born when Shelley was with her lover, her partner, Percy, and with Lord Byron, who was a infamous writer and a known player, if you will, and a cousin or a stepsister, Claire. And they were all together, and they were staying at this inn in the mountains. Weather was bad, and they challenged each other to write a ghost story in the vein of German-type ghost stories. And so Mary Shelley did, and she actually finished her piece and shared it with her fellow writers, and they thought it was good. And they encouraged her to publish it, but women at the time could not publish, so she had to publish it under no name. So it was anonymously published in 1818. We're in 2018 now, so 200 years later, we're still reading the work of a very young woman who wrote a ghost story on a whim while staying in a cottage with her boyfriend. Some of the influences for Frankenstein from Mary Shelley's life and the time in which she lived: there was the notion of galvanism, in which you could apply shocks to something and reanimate them. Now, we see this when I know a lot of you are nursing in the health field, when you shock someone, the body responds. But if you're shocking a dead frog, you're not bringing it back to life. You are reanimating the nerves in it. But at the time, it was considered revolutionary in medicine, and maybe it could lead to bringing people back to life. Mary also came from a pretty hard childhood. Her mother died in childbirth, so she never knew her mother. Percy's wife, her lover, commits suicide. Mary's half-sister commits suicide. And then Mary goes on to be pregnant and have children, and many of them die. So remember, again, it was the 1800s. Maternal health care was not great, and if you could have a child that survived birth and then into infancy, that was pretty good, and she did end up having one child who did do that. There are allusions to other literary pieces in Frankenstein: Prometheus, the Greek myth, Metamorphoses, Paradise Lost, Inferno, and the picture that I have here in this PowerPoint, The Nightmare. There are layers to, I think I called him Walden before, it's Walden. There are layers to the novel Frankenstein. So the first part of Frankenstein, you're hearing from Robert Walton, who is an explorer, and he is writing letters back to his sister. The second part of Frankenstein, you are hearing Dr. Frankenstein tell his tale to Robert Walton after he's been captured on the ship. And the third layer is the creature, or the monster's tale, being told from Dr. Walton, presumably as he's heard it. The point of view switches many times, and therefore, who do we trust? Just like the game of telephone, when you hear it second, third, fourth hand, the story tends to not be completely accurate, so some of the tale and its retelling might be embellished. The synopsis of this piece is that you have Robert Walton, again, the explorer. He's writing letters to his sister. Robert Walton meets Dr. Frankenstein. We get to hear about Dr. Frankenstein's early days, how he created the creature, and how he abandoned the creature. And then we get to hear the creature's tale from his point of view, and then we get to hear the aftermath of Dr. Frankenstein and the creature conflicting and what happens to them. The end of the story concludes with Walton's letters, and the back of your text, if you bought the text that I had required on Blackboard, is full of critical theory essays on Frankenstein, and I may have you read one or two of those in the coming weeks. So that's a bit of an overview on both Gothic fiction and Mary Shelley, and there's a BBC documentary on Mary Shelley that you might want to check out, and for fun, as added material, certainly watch whatever version or versions of Frankenstein that you like. Many of them are not true to the original text, and Frankenstein has changed a lot in the last 200 years, but it's been performed as plays and as movies and as TV shows repeatedly, hundreds of times. So again, think about the fact that a young woman 200 years ago sat down to write a ghost story for fun, and we are still reading it and talking about it and making movies about it, so that's pretty powerful stuff. All right, there's a quick overview. Have questions? Let me know. Thanks.